Hi everyone, it's Darlene. Welcome back for another card video. Today's card is a pretty clean looking watercolor card. I used the Remarkable You stamp set by Stampin' Up. It's new and it comes in two different boxes. Some Peerless watercolors and mostly black soot distress ink. I also added some highlighting with my Zig Clean Color Real Brush black pen. Now I used a new watercolor paper for me. You can see it's got a linen texture to it, almost like a canvas board would have. It's by Canson and it's 136 pound. It's a little bit off-white, so I'll show you how that plays into my card later. Now I'm going to first start by inking up my Lily stamp with Versamark ink, and I'm going to stamp it kind of in the upper quadrant. I'm not going to be using the whole panel. I'm going to be trimming it back. So I'm going to stamp it right there, and then I'll cover it with some white embossing powder, and then I'll heat it to set it. Now I didn't find that the texture bothered my embossing powder at all. I seem to get a pretty good impression. Now for my watercoloring, I'm using this brush, which I'll have the number on my blog post, but the reason why I'm using this is because it has a very, very fine tip. Like I could get just a tiny little bit of watercolor at the top. Now you can see I'm wetting my canvas first, and then I'll pick up some of my Peerless watercolors. This is just watercolor that's on a paper palette, and I'm just going to use a tiny little bit of yellow for the inside of my Lily, daffodil yellow, and then I'm going to be using hunter green at the bottom. So I'm going to wet my canvas first, and then I'll just dip a tiny little bit of color, and it'll do all the work pretty much by itself. So I'm just going to drop it in there and let it spread around. So here's my Distress ink black soot. I'm going to put some on my craft mat, and I'm going to use just this color on the flower. So I'm going to do it piece by piece. So I'm going to wet a small area here, and you can see with the brush I find that it's hard to control the amount of water that comes out. With the aqua painters, I'm more comfortable working with those. But always have your tissue to the side so you can wipe off any excess water or color. So I wet up the area, and then I just dropped a little tiny bit. I mean, I barely touched my paintbrush into the ink on my craft mat. And I dropped it in, and I just kind of let it sit there for a little bit and spread out. And then I blended it just a little bit more with my brush. So you can see here, there's so much water. I've got way too much water. So I took my tissue, and I just dabbed it, and it pulled the water right up with no problem. But using a brush, I find, takes a lot more practice than using an aqua painter, which is why I usually recommend, if you're starting out, to get an aqua painter. So again, just barely taking any black. You can see I barely touched that, and I'm going to drop it into the shadow areas. So I just have to think about this a little bit to figure out where my petals are going to overlap. I kind of picture it in real life to figure out if there was sun shining on it, where would I see a darker area. And so once I drop the color, I let it move a little bit, and then I just blend it out into the rest of the petal. Now you want to make sure you don't cover too much of the petal. You definitely want it to be mostly white. You just want to use black for the shadow areas, because if you blend it too much, then it's just going to look like a gray flower. And I think mine is just on the border of looking like a gray flower. So just be really careful. And if you make a mistake, you can just take your tissue and just pull up the water. Now one other tip, if you do get too much water on your cardstock before you put the color in, you can dry off your brush so that it's, just dry it off on a tissue, and then that brush will actually pull some of the water back up. So you can almost dry it off once you take the water off your brush to pull up some of the water if you get too much down there. Or you can also just wait a few seconds, and it'll usually absorb a little bit more into the paper. So anyway, you can see here I'm highlighting all the shadow areas. I'm going to go ahead and speed this up, turn the music up, and you can watch me color for a little bit. Alright, so here is where I decided to leave it for now, and then you'll see what I did to change it up a little bit later. So I took some Spellbinder square dies. You can use any square dies here, and I'm just going to eyeball it as far as kind of a little bit higher up on the card so that I can get a sentiment underneath, but I just ran it through my Sizzix. And I have a sentiment by alternate. I use this sentiment set all the time, and so I'm just going to pull this off my set and use my Misty and my grid paper to line everything up. So I get it lined up, and then this grid sheet just peels right off. Don't forget to take that off. And then I've got some VersaFine black onyx ink, and I'll stamp that right there at the bottom centered. Now when I put this square hole over my canvas, I really didn't like the look of the off-white against the white. So I ended up deciding to pull the gray out a little bit further so that it went out all the way to the edge of the square. Now I knew this was going to be challenging because it had already dried and I had my water stains and everything else. So I actually think it turned out pretty okay. I made sure that I put a lot of water right on the edge, and it did loosen up the color just a little bit, and then I ended up taking some more black soot, but not directly. I had to mix it. You can see kind of I've got it a little lower on my craft mat there, mixed in with some water because I don't want any really dark spots. And I noticed that if I kind of tapped it around the edge of where that water stain was, it kind of blended it, and I was pretty happy with the way it came out. But anyway, the key is to use a lot of water. I also had a water stain to the left of my left lily here, so I went ahead and wet that up and blended out a little bit more to get rid of it. Alright, so now after letting that dry completely, I'm going to go back in with my Zig Clean Color brush in black, similar to what I did with the butterfly last week. And I'm going to highlight my darkest areas, and it'll really make my flower pop. So what I'm going to do is drop the color in right at the corner, and you can see I'm dropping just a tiny little bit of color, and that's because this marker is very intense. Even though it's called a watercolor marker, it really is not diluted by water at all, but it blends beautifully. So I'm going to drop the color in, and then I'm just going to blend the edge of it with my aqua painter. And I'm going to be careful to have my tissue nearby so that if too much color starts blending out, I can always wipe off my brush and start with clean water. So I'm going to just highlight the darkest areas, and I'll turn up the music and you can watch me do this quickly. You know, I think in the end, because I extended that gray area out, it really made it look like the flowers were really white by doing that. So I was really happy with the way this turned out. Alright, so I'm going to put my square panel on top and see where I need to trim it off. And then I'll take my Scotch foam tape and put it around my frame on the back. And then for the sides, I do this a lot. I just cut it so that it's basically 1/4 of an inch because it's originally 1/2 inch. And then I'm going to place this right on top of my lily panel. And so this is going to be raised up. Now, I had trouble with this paper and my ATG, so it actually would not stick. And I tried this multiple times. I actually also tried it with another tape runner. And you can see here, I'm going to do another one. I'm trying to make it stick with my finger, with my left finger, but every time I touch it with my left finger, it starts to pull up. So finally I decided, you could see I'm going to pull it up. It just peels right off, and I was afraid it wouldn't stick to my card base. So I decided not to use a tape runner, and I just took my Tombow Motto multi-glue and I just zigzagged all over the back of the panel, and that worked just fine. So I'm going to adhere this to my card base, and I'm using my fingertip. I talk about this, my fingertip technique, when I'm using two pieces of cardstock that need to meet exactly. I'll just kind of use my fingertips as a stopper to make sure that the bottom and the top layers are lining up just right. And so that is the card for today. I really like the texture of this cardstock, the watercolor paper, and I like how the lilies kind of look white by adding black. So hopefully you enjoyed that, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.